Hey holidaymakers, you're now listening to the Against the Law podcast. Forget everything you think you know about the ancient world because we're here to set the record straight on historical misconceptions. I now request your full attention as I demonstrate the safety features of this podcast. In case of historical inaccuracy emergency, listen out for this noise. And the exits are here, here and here. If you're headed out to ancient Rome, your flight attendant Zenia will be on hand as your local expert. She's walking on air with her love of the Emperor Hadrian. If she brings him up during the flight, please remember to buckle in and listen out for this sound. Holidaymakers on their way to ancient Greece, Scorchio! Please listen out for Meg, who will be taking us on an odyssey of our own today. If you hear, don't worry, it's not the captain. This sound lets us know we're in for a treat with tales from Homer the Bard. Our next destination is the ancient Near East. Your seat is right next to seasoned traveller Barney, who's ready and waiting to let us all know about the people and places you might find there. If he needs your attention, he'll ring the Babylonian bell positioned above your seat to herald his fun facts about the Babylonian world. I'm Flo, and I don't know much about anything, so make sure you've read your safety booklet and your seatbelt is on tight, because I'm going to be your co-pilot for the day. Today we're going to be learning about the Globetrotters of the ancient world, just like you and me. So we've been hearing a lot of adverts for holidays lately, haven't we? We've all been hearing it, despite the fact that a pandemic's ongoing and we can't actually travel anywhere.
Yeah, I think it's wishful thinking at this stage, isn't it?
It is a bit. But in terms of holidays, have you guys ever travelled to the places that your interests lie? So Zenia, I know that you've travelled to ancient Rome.
Yeah, I really love going to ancient places. I think it's just so awesome to be able to actually be in the location where you know stuff happened in ancient times. And I've been to Greece, to a few different places in Italy, and I've traveled quite a lot to some of the like Roman provinces. Been a lot to Turkey and to Israel.
I cried when I visited the Forum in Rome.
Oh,
It's just like I was like, this is too much. I felt so close to the history literature I've been studying, and it broke me.
wow.
I've also been lucky enough to travel to some of the places that I am interested in historically, although not the Middle East. But I was able to go to Egypt, and I've been there a few times during work. And yeah, there's something incredibly humbling about seeing a lot of the monuments there, and still a hugely prevalent part of modern Egyptian culture. I mean, the most amazing story is that I've been able to stand on the first pyramid that was built at a site called Saqqara. This is through work, by the way, and I don't endorse anyone climbing up pyramids because you will be arrested.
Am I right in thinking that actually the majority of the pyramids aren't in Egypt? Is that an against the law thing?
Yeah, it's Sudan. There's a lot of pyramids in Sudan. Yeah, it's not. I think it's sort of an against the law in that there's only a certain amount of pyramids in the world.
And I think that the pyramids in Egypt are bigger, aren't they?
Yeah, gosh,
yeah.
The Great Pyramids are obviously the most famous ones, quite rightly so, because they are huge. And yeah, Sudan has got lots of little pyramids, basically. So they've gone for the sort of divide and conquer approach.
I think that we really underestimate how well travelled the ancients were.
A lot of it depended on your situation. So if you were wealthy, then you could travel for leisure, but equally there were sort of careers that you could go into that allowed a fair amount of international travel. So for example, in the army, and if you were involved with trade, then that usually involved an awful lot of travel, and that could be across the sea. The Romans had this amazing road network, which was incredibly efficient at transporting goods. So you could get places. It's not as fast as we can get there now. You can't hop on a plane and be halfway across the world in a few hours. It would be more like a matter of weeks. But still, the sort of ways of getting there were more efficient than we might think. You didn't have to walk everywhere.
So there's a quote from Herodotus, the writer and historian, who says that Greeks go to Egypt for 3 reasons: for business, to serve in the army, or to see the country itself. So I think exactly what you're just saying, Zenia. There's that kind of, if you were in a certain profession, like if you were a soldier or if you were a tradesman, you might do a lot of travel. But that quote does also suggest that there is at least an element of what we would call tourism, like going to countries to see that country rather than for another purpose. So I don't know, is there much tourism in Rome?
Yes, there is. So it depends what kind of holiday you want, and it depends what kind of family or what kind of individual you are, and what your budget is. So, um, there you could have like a holiday home, for example, that was really, really popular for especially sort of wealthy senatorial families who lived in Rome, to then have a holiday home down in places like Baiae or Pompeii or Herculaneum even. So Pompeii and Herculaneum we know a lot about because of the eruption of Vesuvius, which very much it's just buried the towns as they were. So we can see some of these wealthy people's fabulous villas that they had. Baiae as well is now underwater. So again, you could do like you can book on a diving trip now to sort of like go down and see what the layout of the town was like. But that had a very strong reputation in the Roman world for being like a sin city, a bit like Saint-Tropez or like Monaco.
That's amazing.
Imagine in the future Las Vegas underwater and people diving down and going, I found a poker chip.
Isn't there a pyramid in Las Vegas?
There is, yeah.
Is there a Luxor
Yes.
hotel and casino? Yeah.
Yes.
Luxor being the city on the ancient site of Thebes, and the temple complex across the river.
Just how far did people travel outside of their countries? Barney, I'm going to ask you this question. How far did people go?
If we situate ourselves in the Neo-Assyrian Empire during the first millennium BC, which is some of the most famous kings, Ashurbanipal, Sennacherib. Ashurbanipal's rule over the Neo-Assyrian Empire saw its maximum extent, extending all the way to Egypt. And he allegedly sacked Thebes, so where Luxor is, that I just mentioned, which is 1,500 kilometers away from the Assyrian capital, Nineveh, and that's a straight line as well. So probably would have been longer in reality. So I think 1,500 kilometers is pretty far. The furthest I've ever been away from home from here is Egypt, and I think that's it's around 2,000 miles from the UK. So pretty far from Iraq.
That's really impressive. And I know that in ancient Rome, people from Syria were at Hadrian's Wall, Zenia.
Oh, I was hoping you would bring that up. Yeah. So this is probably one of the sort of furthest journeys that we have we've got archaeological evidence for. There is a tombstone in South Shields, and the tombstone is for a woman called Regina, and she was enslaved, and she was bought by a Roman soldier who then freed her and married her. Now, this Roman soldier was called Barates, and he was from Palmyra in Syria. And he put up this tombstone to her when she died around the age of 30, sort of commemorating her. But yeah, that's evidence of a soldier who's gone from Syria all the way to South Shields.
What a journey. Meg, how about the ancient Greeks? Did they travel far and wide?
Well, some of them certainly did. Old Alexander, Alexander the Great, went an incredibly long way, all around. He went, from Macedon, where he was from, out through sort of modern day Turkey, all the way through Iran and Iraq, and right up into India, the kind of northwest corner of India, crossing the Khyber Pass, I believe. But he also went to Africa, which I think is interesting because it's kind of, this was a massive military campaign, conquering places, fighting battles along the way. But in the early stages of this, he apparently, according to the sources, had this pothos, which is Greek for kind of yearning or longing to visit Egypt. And he went there, conquered it, founded Alexandria, but then also went on this kind of little tourist trip to the oracle of Amun, who's an Egyptian deity that's associated with Zeus. And yeah, it's really interesting that he has this sort of pothos, which I think is kind of maybe like wanderlust. It's this longing to visit a place. It turns out he kind of wanted to go there because the oracle then conveniently pronounces him the son of Zeus. But I like to think he also had a sort of, an interest in visiting new places as well. But yeah, so he's probably one of the most well-traveled of the Greeks.
We have something similar to that, don't we, in modern culture, where you get Paris syndrome, where you really want to visit Paris. You have a yearning to visit Paris because you've seen it in postcards and films and all sorts, and then you turn up and it's kind of like, eh. But if I turn up to Paris and an oracle proclaimed me the kid of a god, I'd be like, nice, that's all right, that's well worth it.
Yeah, it's like, oh, I went to Egypt and all I got was this lousy son of Zeus pronunciation. It's a good, what's the word for something that you pick up on holiday?
STI?
Souvenir.
Souvenir.
I was going to say, I think the Alexander story is really good because even within the context of Egypt, where he went to get that oracle, which is the Siwa Oasis, is incredibly far from civilization. It's like right out in the desert near Libya.
I didn't realise it was that far out because I remember speaking to someone out in Egypt about developing tourism out into that area. And he was saying that it's really, really difficult to sort of create that infrastructure to go out that far into the desert. So the fact that Alexander the Great back in, the 4th century BC was able to do that, and we're still finding that difficult, I think that's massive, isn't it? There's a famous waterfall that Alexander the Great took a bath in, and in fact he found it so cold that he nearly got pneumonia and died. Anyway, so I went to that waterfall, and that was just so cool, like seeing the actual place. But I didn't decide to take a dip because it was also February.
Where was that waterfall?
It was near Tarsus in Turkey. Tarsus is a pretty cool crossroads, actually. Back in the day, it was this incredible crossroads for so many different, not only military campaigns, but also pretty major events in ancient history. So, Alexander the Great went through there. Cicero is known to have visited it. Julius Caesar went there. Tarsus was where Mark Antony met Cleopatra for the first time. And it's also, Hadrian went through it as well on one of his tours, and St. Paul was born there. So it's paved in these incredible black basalt slabs. This is a fairly sort of rare stone. It doesn't turn up in that many places in the ancient world, but Turkey is quite a big source of basalt. So it already looks very impressive because of the stone they've chosen for this road. And then when you think about who walked on it over the last 2,500 years, I mean, it was quite overwhelming.
I bet. I mean, all these places, someone must have visited them first. Were there any like guidebooks or like travel logs or anything like that? Zenia, did anyone write any geography or tourist books?
Yes, we have Pausanias, who wrote his Description of Greece. And that is basically a travel guide to Greece. He sort of goes through all the main cities. So he is born during the reign of Hadrian in Western Turkey, and then he writes sort of during the reign of Antoninus Pius and Marcus Aurelius. So this is a fairly calm time in Roman history where it's fairly safe to travel around. He's particularly interested in local cults in Greece. So he writes about all these sort of countryside traditions, which are fast becoming overwhelmed by popular religions from the East, like the cult of Mithras.
That's really interesting. I mean, so he was quite rich, so he could afford to travel. If we think about the richest of the rich, so kings and emperors and people in higher positions, was there pressure on those people to travel or do a really good effort in getting around the world?
I think the ancient Near East might be our friend in response to this question, because that like urge to travel was built into the military expression of power in the Neo-Assyrian Empire that I mentioned before, with kings like Ashurbanipal. So theirs was a completely militaristic society, and you constantly needed to appease their chief god Ashur, who had many like warlike attributes by constantly campaigning. So every single year, the kings of the Neo-Assyrian Empire had to go all over the world, and they all went in different directions as well. So there's a king, Sargon II, who battled in Urartu. Urartu is actually where we get Ararat, the mountain where the ark landed after the flood. So it's the same, allegedly the same historical mountainous region. Ashurbanipal went to Iran. Sennacherib sacked Jerusalem. Esarhaddon had Egypt, and so did Ashurbanipal. So yeah, they were stretching out the limits of the empire all the time. But there are downsides to this as well, because basically they were getting to these places and just putting in vassals. So it meant that power was generally quite weak. And once the empire collapsed, so did that huge range that they controlled.
That's a shame. I suppose there's other risks as well when you're travelling, because you might come across, if you're going by sea, you might come across pirates, or if you're going across land, you might come across sort of hostile locals. Meg, did any of the ancient Greeks meet up with pirates or hostile locals?
They definitely did. We were talking earlier a bit about guidebooks. There's this thing called a text called On the Cities of Greece by a guy called Heraclides Criticus. And it's a kind of rough guide to Greece, but he talks quite a lot about he's like, if you go down this road, you're going to be fine, absolutely free from attack by robbers or highwaymen. And then sometimes he's like, okay, no, don't go here. You're absolutely guaranteed to get robbed. So there's absolutely that fear of attack from highwaymen and pirates as well, for sure.
We kind of have that now, where when you are going on holiday, you can look up online, is it safe to travel here? And I know that when I went to Berlin and I went to visit the Berlin Wall, the local travel guide said, don't get engaged in cup and ball games because they're all scams. So I suppose we kind of have an element of that nowadays as well. So did any of these ancient civilizations meet up with other ancient civilizations and go, all right, guys, and have a kind of a meet up?
There were like Xenia relationships, weren't there, between some like aristocratic Greek and Persian families, weren't there, Meg?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, so definitely Zenia is like host-guest friendship, and it's such an important thing in the ancient world, especially in the Greek world, that basically the kind of assumption that if you travel somewhere, someone will offer you bed and board, food, look after you. And that's a big thing in Homer. So in Homer, Zenia is a big thing because it's one of the main ways that Odysseus is able to kind of go on his travels as he tries to get back home from Troy to Ithaca. So he stops at various different places and he's taken in safely.
So that's a bit like nowadays if you were to go on a really low budget backpacking trip and you're relying on people to say, yeah, you can stay the night.
Absolutely. And the knowledge that you'd always be able to find somewhere. I think travel did work quite differently in that sense, that you wouldn't be sort of booking in advance to a nice Airbnb. You had to just take it as it came.
So yeah, obviously I wouldn't be traveling very far on my own as a fairly skint woman. That's not likely. But if I had the means, who would I be aiming to be like? Who is the ultimate ancient traveller?
Well, I would say it's the Emperor Hadrian. And he actually had several women with him on his tour. So we hear about this amazing woman called Julia Balbilla. So Hadrian also goes on a little tourist trail around Egypt. And one of the big tourist attractions in Egypt during his time was this statue of Memnon. And while he was there, Julia Balbilla, who was a bit of a poetess, she graffitis these couple of poems onto the actual statue. So she writes about her trip and Hadrian and Sabina.
So she was basically doing an ancient Yelp review, but in a really
but like literally on the attraction.
So I'm going to suggest a pretty rogue alternative to Hadrian as the greatest of the ancient travellers, Pythias. And he's from Massalia, which is now Marseille in France, but it was a Greek colony. And he is a 4th century BC Greek explorer. And he went to Britain, went to kind of Northern Europe, and there's just loads of really cool things that he sort of claimed to have found and claimed to have seen. And his work is lost. The text has been completely lost, but we have sort of these tantalizing references to it. So he's the first person on record to describe the phenomenon of the midnight sun, where you can still see the sun at midnight. So he must have been pretty near, right at the top of the world. But he also mentions this place called Thule, and it's thought to maybe have been, it could be somewhere at northern Scotland, like the Orkneys or the Shetlands. Recently, I think someone said that it's actually an island off the coast of Norway. Someone has proposed that is Thule. But in the sort of medieval, early modern periods, it was really associated with Greenland and Iceland. And I just think this is so cool. So from Pythias, from Massalia, 330s BC, we get this military base in Greenland, which is called the Thule Air Base, because it has this association with Greenland from the medieval early modern period. So Pythias has this strange influence on the 1950s America founding this air base in Greenland and calling it Thule. And I just think that's so cool. So here's my suggestion, Pythias, for one of the coolest travelers, because he came to Britain. He's one of the first people, I think, to use like the word Britain to describe Britain, that the Britanniques, I think he calls the people who lived here. He talks about Kent and Cornwall and stuff. So he's my vote.
Barney, how about you? Anyone from the ancient Near East you'd nominate?
Yes, I'm going to go against the grain of the other suggestions as well, and suggest a king who maybe wasn't that famous for international travel, but since we're in an era of very limited movement during the coronavirus pandemic, I'm going to go in favour of someone who did the staycation style of travel. So this is Neo-Babylonian King Nabonidus, who was the last king of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, and indeed the last king before the Persians came in and started their massive world empire. And he travelled around quite a lot within his own kingdom, within the realm of Mesopotamia, because he had a reputation as like a bit of an archaeologist king. So he would travel to ancient and important sites like Ur, which is one of the oldest cities of Mesopotamia, where there's a giant ziggurat, like a pyramid-style temple that you can still see today, to other places, Sippar, which is a very important religious city, a place called Haran, and he would dig up ancient temples and restore them, read the inscriptions, and then dedicate new ones in the foundations and build on top. And this is a really important religious thing. So I was going to talk, we talked about military reasons for travel, political reasons, and others. And this is sort of a religious reason for him to be traveling around. And he read ancient texts. So, we modern Assyriologists read ancient cuneiform, but he also found things that were, 1,500 years old by the time that he reigned. He reigned from 555 to 539 BC, so 6th century BC. And he found a statue of the king of the old Akkadian Empire, the first empire, basically, in the Near East, which is around 2200 BC, I think, called Sargon. So he just found all this amazing stuff, and it's kind of rare that you hear about archaeology in the ancient world being something that they were interested in. This was because he travelled around a lot himself.
Did the ancient people have a concept of the edge? Hadrian
was fairly controversial as an emperor by actually physically delineating the edge of the empire. Now, this isn't as often sort of thought of as to keep the barbarians out and the Romans in. Hadrian, though, despite having had one of the best military records that any emperor has ever had, understood the negative aspects of war, and he understood that the Roman Empire, with its administrative system the way it was, could only really cope with a certain amount of territory. And so, having seen some unsuccessful wars happen under Hadrian, under Trajan, he fought with Trajan in the Parthian War, which is out in sort of Iraq, Iran, and he fought with Trajan up in Romania, which was another sort of real edge of the empire. He realized that to continue trying to conquer new lands in those areas was a waste of resources that could better be focused on maintaining the health of the empire as it was. So what he did was he decided to build these walls around the edges of the empire. And that's where we get Hadrian's Wall in Britain. But it's not just in Britain. There's we call it the limes, which actually means threshold in Latin, and that was made of like wood and turf. That's in Germany, so that's delineating the sort of northwestern frontier. There is also a stretch of Hadrian's Wall in North Africa. So I think we talked before about Hadrian going around the ancient world just as a tourist, but most of the time he was going around the empire to do the business of an emperor, to make reforms, to build things, to make speeches to his legions, to improve the way the army operated. In fact, one of his reasons for coming to Britain was to put down some British rebellions. Like, Britain was an incredibly unsafe place to be. He arranged this trip to come to Britain to sort of assert imperial authority in Britain, to sort out any unrest that might have happened, and then to delineate that northern edge, to say, okay, beyond this, we can't administrate. South of this, we can administrate, and you're safe here, and we're going to surveil the area.
That's so cool. So it's sort of like mapping the world, but in a very physical, literally putting the boundaries on the world itself.
I have a good Babylonian understanding the world and not getting it quite right, but doing a pretty good job. Is this really good late Babylonian tablet called the Babylonian Map of the World, and it's a clay map on a tablet, as and everything else cuneiform, with Akkadian annotations all over it. And it only names a few cities, really, and it's got rivers identified, so you can kind of clearly see Mesopotamia. But it's thought to have a legacy that lived on in medieval maps of the world as well. It's impossible to say that they're inspired by it, but I don't know if you guys know about the T&O style of map.
No, I don't.
So
I only know about the P&O style of ferry. Sorry.
So medieval maps of the world were sort of like, they're skewed. They have the east where we have north, because they pointed towards Jerusalem. But this Babylonian map of the world has that very similar circle with a kind of T shape in the middle of it that looks a bit like these medieval maps. So it's one way of mapping the world that might have had continuity. But they sort of just gave up after they named a few cities and they got to the edge, and they just called everything else regions.
Really interesting, guys. Thank you. So I'm going to wrap up here because our flight is actually about to land. So what was your most interesting thing that you've learned today?
I really liked hearing about the city of Tarsus from Zenia, and how that was a city that witnessed so many great ancient leaders passing through it. I think we've talked about this in previous weeks, that one place or person or item can tell so many different stories, and I think that's brilliant to hear one place with so many famous feet walking through it.
I really liked learning about Barney's archaeologist, traveller, king. I think that's the kind of traveller I'd like to be.
I really enjoyed learning about Julia Balbilla, who is my graffiti queen. Just no fear. I wouldn't do it now. I don't condone that behaviour, but I still think it's cool.
Yeah, I really like that as well, and I would love to go to the ziggurat at Ur, and see those sort of layers and layers of history on top of it, and the fact that Nabonidus appreciated those even in his own time. I suppose we don't really think about that, but that's similar to people going to as tourists to Egypt, isn't it, and appreciating that history.
Is that his sense of history within history?
Yeah.
I actually didn't manage to get in. One of the greatest things about Nabonidus is that he spent 10 years in an Arabian oasis when he was supposed to be ruling Babylon.
Just took a break midway through.
It's a nice holiday note to end on, maybe.
Our next episode is going to be about neurodiversity in the ancient world, so I hope to see you there. It'll be our last episode for the season. But don't worry, we'll be back soon with lots of new and exciting topics for you.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Against the Law. If you enjoyed it, hit follow or subscribe so you'll get all our future episodes in your feed. We love hearing from you, so please get in touch with suggestions and feedback on Twitter @AgainstLaw, that's LORE, or email againstthelaw podcast@gmail.com. Bye for now.